Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chilius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone. Today's podcast is sponsored by Venngage. Venngage is a design platform that isn't just about creating stunning visuals, but also about inclusivity and accessibility. Venngage doesn't just simplify your design process, but takes it up a notch with built-in accessibility features. Whether you're looking to run an accessibility check on your designs or export them to the PDF UA format, Venngage has you covered. So head on over to venngage.com and check them out. My name is Chad Chilius. I'm an Adobe certified instructor, as well as director of training solutions and principal at Chax Training Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I'm director of media productions here at Chax Training Consulting. And Chad and I are both certified as accessible document specialists. And if you'd like yours certification, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org/certification. And get more information. It's a great, we just got an email from someone who passed their certification, who we have been kind of had under our wing for quite some time. And it's been really great. In fact, Chad, we are now free to do a study course for
That's
the
right.
IAA, for the ADS test. So maybe we should put that on our radar for 2024 as we are closing the year for another year of the podcast.
Yeah, we're now in December, right? So last month of the year, and I have to tell you, buddy, I'm glad that conference season is over.
Oh,
you know, like you and I had a lot of travel, a lot of work, and as much as I love the conferences, the fall is just a busy time for us. You know, a lot of things going on. So end of the year,
we can breathe until March. Then we have
exactly when CSUN is here. So
we
got a little bit of time to prepare for that.
Yeah, I'm excited about the pre-conference lab for CSUN. I think it's going to be great. And it's always great when you can sit down at a computer and actually do the work and ask the experts while you're there and really get that fundamental, here's doing it, not just watching someone on the screen talk about here's how to do it. And I think
absolutely
that's a big difference.
Absolutely.
So. And we're going to have a crap ton of handouts too. So for all of you who are like, give me more handouts, we're going to have a ton.
Yep. I know when we did our last one at Accessing Higher Ground, we opened it up for people to submit their own files.
Yeah, that was great, actually. Yeah.
And so maybe we'll do the same thing for CSUN. You know, we can let people upload some files and we can take a look at them during the class. So I think it's really valuable. You know what I mean? Because, you know, as much as we try to explain, you know, how to handle different situations, everybody's documents are different, you know, and that's what makes it kind of challenging. And so to be able to kind of like look at what people are working with and be able to dissect it and explain, you know, how to approach it, I think is really, really valuable.
Well, that actually is a really good segue into our topic for today, which is forms and tables, right? So we get this all the time. People say, oh my gosh, I've got this form, but it's in a table. And my first reaction is, okay, that's not the end of the world. What does it look like? Because you and I both know that the table is not the evil here. It's how you create the table that's the evil, right?
It is. And I think that there's a couple of things at play here, right? I mean, you know, there's so many different variations of how you can build forms in a table. But I mean, in a lot of situations, people like to kind of merge cells and have fields of varying length through the table.
Right.
And the fundamental issue that you're most likely to encounter is the dreaded regularity error, right? You know what I mean? Because every row has a different number of cells. But that being said, I think you were talking about the fact that, you know, if you're reading a form, you know, you're typically reading it from left to right.
Right.
in
That's the
every single
expected
row.
user experience, right?
Right.
That a table reads from left to right. And you've talked about this many times, where the automatic user experience, the default automatic user experience is that the cursor will move, focus will move from left to right, moving cell to cell. And so the issue becomes when you start merging cells and creating experiences that require the user to think vertically. And so there's no way, when like, we take a look at the table that I have on the screen here. It's just some colored cells that kind of mimic what some form areas might look like, right? And for
Mhm.
those of you listening to the podcast, it's basically field for what we would say name, or whatever the label is for the form field, and then another cell or another column for the form field itself. But then after that is a new label column and a new form field column. And we typically see this when you have person one, or registrant one, and then spouse, right, or partner. And when you have that vertical alignment, now it's not intuitive for the end user, because they're going to hear name and then input name and then name input name. They're going to hear it twice because they're going person one to person two, rather than name, birth date, social security, whatever it is, vertically. And that's a really confusing user experience.
Yeah. Yep. And kind of getting back to the merged cells,
Right.
right? The reality here, that you could run into, is that this table may not pass the checker,
Right.
right? Um, and it's probably one of the few times where you and I are going to sit here and say that's okay, right? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, what I would say though is, and we've said this before, I think there would be value, right, prior to the table in the document, having a little description of what the user is about to experience, right?
Right.
Kind of let them know, hey, this is how this table is structured. As you're navigating it, this is what you can expect, to hear, to experience,
Well,
and I
but
think
this
that
is
could
where
go a long way.
Well, let's take a look at our sample, right? So I've made a column header called primary for the first column. And if you make that a column header, then when the person gets to name, they're going to hear primary name. And then
Mhm.
they're going to go to the right and they're going to hear enter first name. And then when they go to the right again without knowing that there's something new, they're going to hear secondary name. And they're going to
Mhm.
go, oh, okay. And then they move to the right again. And now they're going to hear the form, the form field of enter secondary name. Right.
Right.
So having those column headers there is really a very key point when you're trying to create a table like this. The problem becomes what you talked about before, is that halfway down the table, if you've merged a cell that goes all the way across, and now we're in a new section of the form where it's a new format, that merged row doesn't do anything for the screen reader.
Yeah.
It's still going to try to say primary and secondary. So this is
Mhm.
where cell IDs come into play, right, Chad?
They do, right? I mean, and cell IDs are how we. They're the fundamental way of making a complex table accessible, right? And if you've merged those cells, if you've done that, that is how we have to make that happen. And we've talked about this before. I mean, doing it in Acrobat is painful, right?
Right.
Just to at the very best, it's painful, right? It's time consuming, it's painful. So you probably want to reach for a third party product. You could use Common Look, you could use Access PDF. A number of products will allow you to do that. But the other thing to say, Dax, is if you're going into a section of the table that now has a different format, is the better approach to just make it a new table.
Agreed. And
You
that's
know?
the thing that people don't know, is that visually you could design this all in Excel just the way we have it on screen now, where it's all one table. But in the tags tree, you can then break it apart and have it be multiple tables. And it's still going to look correct when the cursor focuses from item to item. So in this case, I would make this whole top part one table, then make insurance its own table and dependence its own table. And I would even go a step further, Chad. I know you're already thinking about this. I would not put insurance in that first row. It would just be a header. I would take it out of the table structure and dependence as well. And it's most likely that these first cells here are going to be row headers for the items to the right of them. Now, here's where the problem becomes, in that when you stack row headers in the same row, you're going to get the same problem you had before with them being stacked in the same column. So again, you'll still have to use cell IDs. And so if I were designing this table, I would want to be careful about how complex I'm making that structure. We can look at this table and see, we're just trying to make a perfect rectangle. We want it all to line up and everything to be right. But then how much are you really, how much work are you pinning yourself into doing because you want this perfect table? It's all possible, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, a lot of times these decisions are made by people above our pay grade, right? For lack of a better term, that there are people who are kind of dictating the look and feel of this, and they're like, nope, it has to look this way, right?
Right.
That section you were just talking about, Dax, the other thing we could do is just make it a 4-row table,
right?
Keep it looking the way it's looking, but make it a 4-row table, and then it's going to read perfectly, because you would have 4 header rows and 4 data cells. It's literally, in my opinion, the coolest thing about document accessibility. The ability to modify the structure without visually affecting the look of the document, to me, is just phenomenal, right? And the only place you could do it is with documents. You can't do that on a web page, right? Because on a web page, content is content.
Well, I was just having that conversation. We had our class yesterday, designing with accessibility in mind, and someone brought that up and said, what about when is PDF not, or they said HTML seems like should be your first solution. And I said, well, should be a consideration, but there are many times where a PDF, I have more granular control over the content because we have these 2 layers, the visible layer and the code layer. Whereas in HTML, it's a lot harder to hide the code and present 2 different things, because the screen reader is designed to read that code. And so, it's much more of a, as you say, sticky wicket. So, it really is a thing. Now, looking at this table, I've kind of modified it here. I actually I'm going to take this and put it on a new sheet, because I think it'll be too hard to modify with that other one sitting there. But if I had this insurance that spans all the way across the row, and I wanted to make this a new table, right? It would be much better if I just made it a first column, right? So we can remove these 2 rows, and now we have insurance and dependence. And then for these up here, of course, these would all need to be merged and centered, each one down the line. I think I can do that. Look at that. And then my Excel skills are showing. So then merge and center, or maybe left, right? And so now everything is going to read better, and it's going to be much easier for you to then remediate this content. And so that you still have an issue with these repeating row headers. So what you could do is, instead of having it be double column, you just insert, let's do this. Yeah, I think I can do this. Insert copied cells. Nope, I guess I can't. X, V, C, V. What I'm doing right now is I'm adding that duplicate content and merging it together so that that you can have basically no row headers that are repeating across the table. And so in this case, I would clear all of this, no fill, and these would just become, I don't know what color that is, that color, right? I'm not going to completely do this, but the idea is that now I have 4 single rows with the content rather than 2 columns with 2 in each row. And so the idea here, guys, is that I can design this in a way that removes my need to do advanced remediation if I just think about it a little bit, right?
Yes. I mean, I have sat down with clients, when we're dealing with like complex tables like this, and we've kind of like evaluated the table.
Right.
And during that evaluation process, the client has these moments of clarity, and they're like, oh, we don't even need that row anymore. You know what I mean? Like all of a sudden they realize, because, so many people, so many clients, they're doing things because that's the way they've always done them.
Agreed.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like this table was developed 15 years ago, and they just keep doing it that way. And once you force them to sit down and reevaluate it, when you've got a complicated table, it's like, listen, does it need to be this complicated? Can we simplify it? And you and I say this all the time, Dax. I mean, the best advice I can give you when working with tables is make them as simple as possible. Right?
Yes.
Yep. Don't overcomplicate them, because a lot of times people do. They overcomplicate those tables, and it's just a lot of times unnecessary.
Well, and that's the part where understanding what it means, what the implication is when you design, right? The design, going back to designing with accessibility in mind, if you don't know what if the result or the penalty you're going to have, the extra work you're going to have to do because you just made it 2 column rather than 1, then that's the problem. And then you go to remediate the PDF and you're like, I can't get this to work. Yeah. And that's why people struggle with accessibility, because if you don't understand the implications of your actions and design, you're not going to understand how to fix it in the end to get a compliant PDF. And so now I've kind of added some form field and labels here, right? I guess really these would be merged and centered as well. So it would look, I guess, there we go, merge and center. And then I drop that down. All right. So either way, but the idea here is that you would just have those individual labels and the form fields, and that's fine. So this is design of using a table to design a form field, but we haven't really talked about the question of, is it appropriate to use a table for a form? And should I remove the table structure, spend the time in the PDF to remove the table structure if I'm given a table, a form that is inside a table?
Right. And again, you're what you always have to also kind of remember is that you can have it look like a table and not structure it as such. Like you could always pull that content out of the table if it makes more sense.
Well, when would it make more sense, Chad? So this is the question people want to know, right?
Yeah.
So I've got a table and I'm considering, do I pull it out of the table or leave it in? What's the litmus test? What makes it matter one way or the other?
Yeah, well, I would say like when the table gets so complicated that you're struggling to make it compliant with the content in the table, right? Because fundamentally, I mean, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get the user to read the content in a certain order,
Right.
right? Now, in a table, arguably, it's harder to control that
Hmm.
because once a user enters a table, they can go left, right, up, and down, right? They're just navigating within that table. So the order in which they do that, well, that's really out of our control, right?
Right, but
Um,
we need to have that programmatic association when we
yeah,
present the form so that they can identify what are column headers, what are row headers, what is that structure. So imagine you've got a table and somewhere in that table there's a cell that has the heading for that section, but it also has the first piece of information, the first label for the first form field. So in
yeah.
that one cell, there's the heading for the section, the first, enter first name text, and then the cell for the text. There's three different things in one cell. And then you move to the next cell and it's just the name, the birth date and form field, right? That's one
Mhm.
of those situations where way too much information. It should be one cell programmatically associated. And it's okay to have name and then the form field in one cell if in the next cell you have birth date and form field in
Mhm.
that cell. Keeping it consistent is really the key, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. You know, you know, you and I always talk about the user experience, right? And that's the thing that I always try to think about, whenever I'm especially with tables, right? Form fields and tables, right? And we need to remember too, right, that every form field needs to contain descriptive text.
Right.
Excuse me. Um, and that descriptive text is incredibly valuable because you typically have a label for the form field, like just like you have in the table. You have a label that's going to say first name.
Right.
And then when they get to the form field is going to say enter your first name here, you know
Right.
so that tooltip, I know a lot of us are can become a little bit annoyed with that requirement because it's a lot of extra work, isn't it? We
Yeah.
have to go in and every single form field has to have a description. But um if we keep in mind that the user of assistive technology, if they switch over to forms mode, now it's a whole different ball game, isn't it, Dax?
Right, because they're only going to hear the form field itself. So if you say in the text, I always use the example of social security number must be in the following format, right? And they want you to either use the dashes or not use the dashes, right? And they'll put that in body text on the page. But then in the form field itself, there'll be no instruction. It just says enter social security number, right? That's where you have a disparity between what's on the page and what's in the form field. And that's one of those important things. The other thing to note is that, there are often times where you've got a table that is in the way of how the form is structured. And removing each of those items out of the TDs and TRs is a pain in the butt. Common Look has a feature. It's a linearized table. And when you open the PDF inside Common Look, you can just select the table and hit right click and hit linearized table. And it will literally pull all of the content right out. And then, of course, in Access PDF, you can remove content from its parent and kind of keep leveling up that content. It takes a few steps, but it's the same result, right? So just
Right.
realize that if you're doing it by hand, there are tools out there that will allow you to do it. In fact, if you've built your form base in Word, you can use Access Word to mark that table as a layout table. And then when you export, none of the table structure will come through. It will just be the form labels and things as you would hope. So the approaches are different, but there are tools out there that'll help you get past it. And I think the biggest takeaway we want to let people know is that it's about consistent user experience. Yeah. And when you have more than one value in a cell, it can be the trigger to say, hey, maybe this shouldn't be in a table. Now, of course, if it's the name and form field, that's okay. But any more than that, now we become, it becomes a problem. I've seen cells where they, on the top row in really small text, it's name or first name, last name, date of birth. And then the form fields are right after it, first name, last name, date of birth. The end user will hear the text all in a row and then the form fields all in a row. And that's a bad user experience, right? So it's those types of things that should tell you, okay, maybe I need to break this out of the table.
Well, and, we need to realize, right? I mean, there's currently, that I know of, there's currently only one application that allows me to do this work in the source application.
Right.
And that's Adobe InDesign.
Of course.
I don't know of any other application that lets me do this work in the source. I guess you could argue AEM Forms Designer, but that's a whole other animal.
Well, but just so that our listeners know, if you design an AEM Forms Designer and you have to edit that Acrobat file, good luck. You can't, right?
No.
From a forms, if you think, oh, I'll design this in AEM Forms and then I'll just remediate my PDF afterward, you're stuck, because AEM Forms, it all has to be done in the source, and whatever you get is what you get.
Well, and you can't even, I apologize to our listeners. We've gotten on a little bit of a segue, but it's all related to building forms. And there are people out there who use AEM Forms Designer to build our forms. The real kicker when you're doing that is that you can't even check that document using any other checker. You can't use Acrobat. You can't use PAC 2024, 2021. You have to use the checker that's built into AEM Forms. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, like, of all the situations, that's one of the most important times that you want to test using a screen reader.
Right.
Because, you're kind of taking its word for it that it's accessible. You know what I mean? So it's, AEM Forms is a whole other animal that I don't think we want to go too deep into that in this session, but basically, I think what you and I are saying is think about the user experience, try to create a user experience that is going to be easy to understand. It's going to be clear to the end user, and they're going to be able to navigate it without any significant barriers,
And it's a consistent, what you really, in addition to those great points, Chad, you definitely want to make sure that it is reading left to right and that you have a consistent user experience. And if you can say that about your table, do not waste the time to break it out of the table, right? Yeah. Don't, there's no rule that says it can't be in a table. But the moment you start having inconsistent user experience, you have to read vertically, maybe, the cells are stacked on top of each other. The end user's not going to know that that's there. And that's a key kind of way or trigger to say, okay, maybe I should break this out of the table. And the other point we made earlier is don't be afraid to make it into multiple tables. Right.
Yeah.
And in this case of the table we have on screen, I've now kind of finished it. And so this top piece for primary and secondary could be one table. It could be two tables, one table for primary and one table for secondary. And then for insurance and dependents, we definitely could have one table or two as well. I probably would leave it as one because it follows a very consistent structure. And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, what I've done is primary, it has a column span of 2 and it encompasses the label and form field for the first person. And secondary has a column span of 2 and encompasses the label and form field for the second person. And then below it, in the same rectangle structure, we have insurance as a row header and dependents as a row header. And instead of having the 2-column layout where we had label, form field, and 2 columns, we've now made it 1 column and have 4 label form fields just all stacked on top of each other. Now the screen reader will have no problem with this whatsoever. But the kicker, the important thing to know here is that you need to break this insurance and dependents out of the first table because it's a different structure, right?
Yeah.
And that's, hopefully that for those of you following along from an Audible standpoint, that was clear. The idea here, guys, consistent user experience, left to right navigation, and you're gonna be okay.
And I highly encourage our listeners, read a form using assistive technology.
Yeah.
Open up JAWS, open up NVDA, and literally read a form. I learned so much just by doing that, Dax, right?
Yep.
Like when you understand how it works, and then you also start to understand, because I used to have people ask me all the time, why do I have to nest the form tag in with the text, inside of the document? And you really learn that, you learn why. And I would say when you're testing the document, make sure in JAWS and NVDA you switch over to forms mode. I know it's called forms mode in NVDA. Is it called forms mode in JAWS?
JAWS will automatically switch into focused mode in as soon as you hit a form field, it'll switch you into focus mode. If you want to be in browse mode, you have to insert spacebar, and then it will put you back out of focus mode.
I think NVDA will too if you hit the tab key.
Sure.
Like if you hit the tab key, it
you're
switches
right
automatically over to forms mode. Yeah,
you are right. Yeah.
But you learn a lot, guys, right? I know Dax and I preach this all the time, test your documents using NVDA, but a lot of what we know is because we test our documents, know, and it allows you to make educated decisions along the way. People ask us all the time, like, how should I structure this? The only way you and I know that is because of the experience. We know how certain things are read, and we know how to create a better experience. So it's a fun little exercise.
Yep. If you can use the arrow and tab key, you can use a form using NVDA. So
yeah.
Awesome. All right.
Cool. So hey, a little bit of news that we could share with our listeners. This past week, right? I know, Dax, you and I have been beta testing this for a little while, but just this past week, the PAC 2024 checker was released.
Yeah.
And it's a new version of the PAC checker. The previous version was 2021, right? 2021. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's been 3 years since they updated it. Yep. And we now have a new version. There's been some new features that were added. They did improve the color contrast checker, which a lot do. And
I'm still hearing people are getting errors using it. So
okay.
In the Facebook group, there's been quite a few. And for those of you who don't know, we have a PDF accessibility Facebook group. We've blown past 4,000 users now. We're like 4,125 or something like that. But the PAC checker 2024, it's got some great bones. They've introduced this new thing called quality checks that aren't really mandatory things, but they're like best practices, good to know things. And then they've also given some little helps and hints. So if you get the error, what do I do about this error? They've given you some different avenues to go search for some different solutions. Some they provide you with the solution of, hey, go check this, this, and this, or others they bounce you to a Google search they've already predetermined is a good use of the thing. But the color contrast checker still is having problems with using rules and paragraph shading on text if you're using InDesign. So just know that that's still a thing.
That's interesting, because I did do a 1-to-1 check on one of the documents I was working on, and at least in the document that I was working on, the new checker did do a better job. But
sure,
I fully believe that, it is. Keep in mind, guys, it is V1, right?
Right.
Or version 1, right? So
Yep.
it's a brand new product, new features. So we're bound to have bugs, but that there is promise, right? That
Oh,
there's
I
definitely
agree. I
promise,
think it's
and
going to be great when
yeah,
it's all hashed out. I like the idea of the quality checks. I like the idea of giving them answers. In fact, you and I were considering working on a document that was the answers to all of the pack errors. And when we
yeah,
approached Access 4 and said, hey, can we get a list of all the errors? They're like, what for? And so once they kind of said, hey, we're already working on this, we kind of backed off and said, sure, let you can do the work.
yeah,
We're happy. So
absolutely.
I agree. I think it's good. I'm excited to see where it goes. And I think it's always been a really valuable tool. The screen reader preview is still there.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
some of the structure stuff is really good too. When you're identifying like how many headings are in my document, how many H1s and things like that, you can use the checker to kind of go in there and search through the structure, which I thought was really a cool kind of feature. Yeah, I was excited to be on the testing team. So yeah.
yeah. Likewise. I mean, it's always. I'm always excited when we get new products, right? I'm always
Yep.
excited when the promise of making this process easier, and easier to find problems in your files. I mean, everybody wins, when we get something like that. So, really, really looking forward to seeing what they can add to that as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Awesome, guys. Well, listen, thank you so much for tuning in. It was, I think we had a really good discussion about forms and tables, and I hope you guys all enjoyed that as well. So, once again, we want to thank Venngage for being our sponsor for today's podcast. Again, Venngage doesn't just simplify your design process, but it takes it up a notch when building accessibility features. So go ahead and head on over to venngage.com. That's VENNGAGE.com, and check them out. My name is Chad Chilius.
And my name is Dax Castro, where each week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.